The low hum of the radio filled the empty night, blending seamlessly with RJ Mira's soothing voice as she welcomed listeners to Nightmare Chronicles. The clock struck midnight, the perfect hour for ghost stories, but tonight the stories wouldn't come from her callers, they would come from her past. The studio lights were dim, casting long shadows across the room as Mira settled into her chair, microphone in hand. She always felt a strange comfort in the isolation of the late night shift. Just her, the glowing buttons, and the faceless voices of the callers. Nightmare Chronicles was her escape, a way to lose herself in other people's fears. As the familiar intro music faded, Mira leaned into the mic. Welcome to Nightmare Chronicles, where your nightmares come to life. Tonight, we're opening the lines for your stories. Call in if you've had a brush with the supernatural. The phone lines lit up immediately, but something about the flickering lights sent a shiver down her spine. She brushed it off, attributing it to the eerie stories she would soon hear. Let's hear from our first caller, she said, pressing the button. A soft breath came through the speaker, followed by a long silence. Mira, the voice whispered, barely audible. Mira's blood ran cold. She knew that voice. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced to place the voice. It was too familiar, hauntingly so. Who is this? She asked, her voice steady but strained. A pause, and then, it's Daniel. Mira's heart dropped. It wasn't possible. Daniel had died years ago in a car accident. She had been there. She had watched his life slip away, her own hands trembling, unable to save him. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the control panel, as if it could explain the impossibility of what she was hearing. This isn't funny, she whispered. Who's playing this sick joke? Silence hung on the other end of the line. Then, softly, Daniel's voice came again, calm and almost affectionate. I've missed you, Mira. I thought I'd stop by. Mira's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning. This couldn't be happening. The rational part of her wanted to shut off the call, to tell herself it was a cruel prank. But something about the quiet, measured tone in Daniel's voice, so calm, so familiar, kept her from moving. She remembered that night, the accident, the way she had walked away, her guilt weighing heavier than the secret she had carried for years. Daniel's death was no simple tragedy. It was a mistake she could never take back. And now, his voice was back, as if nothing had changed. I'm here, Mira, he said, the whisper almost lost in the crackle of the radio. Watching, listening. Don't you want to say hello? Mira's hand hovered over the button to cut the call, but she couldn't bring herself to press it. Why now? She finally asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. I wanted to hear your voice again, Daniel replied softly, and remind you, we never said goodbye. Her heart pounded in her chest as the studio suddenly felt colder, the air thick with something unseen. There was no aggression in Daniel's voice, no threat, just a simple fact, a quiet, unsettling presence that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. Mira glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see his ghost standing behind her, but the studio remained empty. The radio hissed softly in the background, the hum of the equipment suddenly too loud. She shook her head, trying to regain control. This can't be real. Daniel's voice stayed calm, almost comforting. It's real, Mira. I've been waiting for this moment. Quietly, I'll wait as long as it takes. The words were like a slow poison, creeping into her thoughts, turning every shadow in the studio into something sinister. The longer she sat there, listening to the quiet hiss of the phone line, the more Mira felt the room closing in. The walls seemed to press in tighter, the shadows growing darker. There was no violent outburst, no crash or sudden movement, just the slow, suffocating weight of Daniel's presence. "I'm not angry," he whispered. "I just wanted you to know that I'm still here. I've always been here." Mira's skin prickled as his voice washed over her. She glanced at the reflection in the glass window separating her from the empty control room, half expecting to see him standing there. But the glass showed only her pale, trembling face. "You've been running, Mira," Daniel continued, his voice so soft it almost blended with the static. "But you can't run from this. You can't run from me." The quiet certainty in his words terrified her more than any scream or threat ever could. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was final. Mira stared at the phone, its quiet crackle filling the empty space between them. Her mind raced for a way out, a way to escape the suffocating weight of Daniel's voice. The calmness in his tone, the certainty, only made it worse. She could feel him, not in a violent, ghostly way, but like a shadow creeping through the room, wrapping around her. Suddenly, the studio lights flickered, plunging her into darkness for a split second before they returned, dimmer than before. The control panel in front of her sputtered, the lights blinking erratically as if responding to some unseen force. "I've been waiting," Daniel whispered again, his voice now impossibly close. It felt like he was right next to her, breathing down her neck. Mira's pulse quickened as she stood, stumbling back from the desk. She needed to leave to get out of the studio, but her legs felt heavy, her body rooted to the spot. Her breath came in short gasps, her eyes darting around the room. But she couldn't see him. He wasn't physically there. He didn't need to be. "Mira," Daniel's voice crooned softly, like a lullaby. "Let me in." Her head throbbed, a sudden pressure building behind her eyes. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white as pain seared through her skull. It was as if something, or someone, was pushing into her thoughts, taking root inside her mind. The pressure in her head grew unbearable, an invisible force creeping through her, cold and relentless. Mira's vision blurred, her body trembling as Daniel's presence wrapped itself around her mind, slipping deeper, taking hold. "You should have stayed with me that night," he whispered. His voice wasn't angry, just sad. "But now you can stay with me forever." Mira opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her hands loosened their grip on the desk, falling limp at her sides as the darkness closed in, slowly blotting out the studio, the equipment, everything around her. She sank into the chair, eyes vacant, staring blankly at the blinking lights of the phone panel. The lines were quiet now, the soft hum of the radio the only sound left. When the morning crew arrived, they found Mira slumped in her chair, her body cold. The radio still broadcasting nothing but static. The studio was eerily still, and though her eyes were open, they were empty, lifeless. Phone lines remained silent, but no one would ever know what really happened to RJ Mira, not even the callers who tuned in night after night. They'd tell their stories, unaware that the Nightmare Chronicles had claimed one last victim